Have you ever paused to imagine how drastically different our world might look today if one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history simply never took place? Picture, just for a moment, an America untouched by the turmoil of its own civil war, a nation whose foundations were never shaken by the violent struggle over slavery, states' rights, and union. How profoundly would the absence of this war alter our understanding of freedom, unity, and national identity? It's fascinating, isn't it? A single alteration in the historical timeline, no matter how seemingly small, can ripple outward, reshaping entire centuries in unimaginable ways. The American Civil War wasn't merely a clash of armies on battlefields. It was a seismic event that defined what it meant to be American. It set in motion dramatic societal transformations, drove advancements in technology, and forced America to confront deeply rooted injustices. But what if, in an alternate universe, cooler heads prevailed, compromises succeeded, and the devastating conflict that cost more than 600,000 lives was averted altogether? Consider the immediate consequences. Millions of enslaved people might remain trapped within a system of oppression, their dreams of liberation deferred, perhaps indefinitely. Would America have become a country split in two, not physically by battles, but culturally, economically, and politically by irreconcilable differences? Without the trauma of war, could slavery have ended peacefully through gradual reform, or would the cruel institution have thrived for decades longer, permanently embedding itself into the American economic fabric? And beyond those early decades, what about the far-reaching implications on America's growth and place in the world? Without the intense drive toward innovation spurred by wartime necessity, would the United States have become a global industrial leader? Or would the nation have stagnated, a primarily agricultural society divided into distinct regions with separate and often opposing interests? Now, let's stretch our imagination even further. Picture the 20th century unfolding without the United States as the influential power we've come to know. World War I rages across Europe, yet America, never hardened by internal conflict or unified by shared sacrifice, hesitates. Without American intervention, could history have tilted toward a vastly different conclusion, a stalemate, or even a German victory reshaping global politics and power dynamics in ways we can barely fathom? Moreover, how would the absence of this fundamental conflict shape the American psyche itself? Today, we understand America as a melting pot, a nation whose identity emerged from struggle, reconciliation, and the eventual pursuit of civil rights. But would an America untouched by civil war instead remain fractured along deep regional lines, each region developing its own isolated sense of identity and cultural values, profoundly disconnected from one another? I find myself captivated by these possibilities because they invite us to reflect not only on history, but on our very essence as human beings and societies. History is rarely inevitable. It is a series of choices, conflicts, and compromises. When we ponder what might have been, we appreciate the fragility and contingency of our present-day freedoms and values. As we journey into this alternate reality together, ask yourself this critical question. Would avoiding the Civil War have truly saved America from suffering and strife, or would it merely have postponed an even greater reckoning with its own contradictions and injustices? Let that curiosity ignite your imagination as we explore this fascinating alternate history scenario together, step by step. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, stands as one of the most pivotal and transformative events in the history of the United States, a moment when the nation's very soul was contested on battlefields, in political chambers, and in the hearts of its citizens. To truly understand the monumental implications of imagining a world in which this conflict never took place, we first need to dive deeply into its context, its root causes, and the profound influence it had on shaping America as we know it today. In the decades preceding the Civil War, America was a rapidly growing yet deeply fractured country. From its founding, the United States struggled with a contentious contradiction. The promise of liberty and equality was overshadowed by the brutal reality of slavery. This institution, fundamental to the Southern economy, particularly in the expansive cotton plantations of states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, was fiercely defended by those who profited from the forced labor of millions of African Americans. In stark contrast to northern states driven by an increasingly industrial economy, viewed slavery as morally reprehensible and economically outdated, advocating instead for its containment and eventual abolition. Tensions simmered beneath the surface of American society for generations. Politicians attempted to maintain balance through uneasy compromises like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, each intended to keep a fragile peace between free and slave-holding states. However, these measures were temporary band-aids over a deep, festering wound. Every new state admitted to the Union reignited fierce debates, and the stark differences in values, economies, and cultures between North and South only intensified over time. The breaking point arrived with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a figure whose stance against expansion of slavery terrified Southern leaders, who saw their way of life and economic survival threatened. To them, Lincoln's victory represented a clear danger to the status quo, and it triggered a dramatic response: the secession of South Carolina from the Union in December 1860. Rapidly, 10 other Southern states followed suit, banding together as the Confederate States of America. Suddenly, the nation stood on the brink of war, divided by irreconcilable differences over liberty, governance, and humanity itself. When war finally erupted in April of 1861 with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, few Americans anticipated the scale of devastation that lay ahead. It became not only a battle over slavery and states' rights, but a defining struggle for national unity, identity, and the very meaning of freedom. Over 4 brutal years, the conflict ravaged communities, tore families apart, and claimed over 600,000 lives, more than all American casualties in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. The Civil War, however destructive, brought lasting transformation. It culminated in the abolition of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation and later the 13th Amendment, forever reshaping America's social and political landscape. Furthermore, the war dramatically accelerated America's industrial revolution, prompting innovations such as railroads, the telegraph, and new wartime technologies, propelling the United States toward becoming a global industrial powerhouse in the years following the conflict. Most profoundly, the war set the stage for the civil rights movement, even if full equality was painfully delayed. Reconstruction after the war, although challenging and incomplete, laid important groundwork for future struggles towards racial justice and equality, a journey America continues even today. Reflecting on this historical reality underscores the immense significance of the Civil War. It wasn't merely a battle over territory or political control. It was a profound confrontation over America's soul, its foundational values, and the future of freedom itself. This understanding provides a perfect stage for exploring the tantalizing question: what if the Civil War, with all its agony and triumph, had never happened? How differently would our nation, and indeed our world, have evolved? Let's venture into that intriguing possibility together. Imagine stepping into an alternate timeline, a world where the American Civil War was averted, a reality where America took a vastly different path than the one we know today. Without the tragic violence and profound upheaval of the war, society, economy, and politics would have evolved dramatically differently. Let's explore this fascinating scenario together, considering key events and their possible alternate outcomes. Societally, had the Civil War never taken place, America would have remained a deeply divided nation, both culturally and morally. The existence and persistence of slavery would have meant that millions of African Americans remained trapped within a cruel and exploitative system. However, perhaps without immediate armed conflict, abolitionist movements could have gradually intensified their efforts through grassroots activism and political reform. The moral imperative to end slavery might become an even greater unifying cause among reformers in the North, driving gradual emancipation efforts in border states, and possibly even influencing some moderate Southerners. Nevertheless, it's difficult to envision slavery ending quickly or easily without a profound national reckoning. In this alternate scenario, America might have evolved into a nation distinctly defined by regional identities. The North, increasingly industrial and progressive, would likely have continued pushing economic innovation, urbanization, and education, attracting immigrants and creating vibrant multicultural cities. Conversely, the South, still economically dependent on agriculture and slave labor, could have entrenched itself deeper in traditional agrarian values, with society remaining sharply hierarchical. without the shared trauma and eventual reconciliation prompted by the war. These regional differences might have become even more pronounced, possibly leading to political deadlock and societal polarization. Economically, without the war-driven innovations of the Civil War, America's Industrial Revolution might have unfolded far more slowly. Wartime necessity accelerated technological advancements like railroads, telegraphs, and manufacturing. Without this intense push, the United States could have remained primarily agricultural for much longer. The Southern economy, heavily dependent on cotton and slave labor, would have likely prospered economically in the short term but stagnated in terms of innovation and diversification, becoming increasingly isolated from the industrialized global economy. However, imagine if slavery's gradual decline occurred economically rather than violently. A peaceful transition might have allowed the South time to adapt economically, potentially reducing the devastating poverty and regional disparity that followed actual Reconstruction. Perhaps the South would have developed alternative industries, slowly modernizing without the devastating setback of war. This scenario raises intriguing possibilities. Could gradual shift toward free labor have generated broader economic prosperity for the South, thus reducing economic divisions that persist even today? Politically, the absence of the Civil War would have reshaped the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Without wartime pressures, Lincoln might have been compelled to seek careful compromises, navigating the political complexities of maintaining the Union without sacrificing core anti-slavery principles. However, this could have severely limited his legacy as the great emancipator, perhaps relegating him to history as a cautious reformer rather than a transformative leader. Yet another possibility arises, delaying conflict rather than avoiding it entirely. Lincoln's election marked a turning point that Southern leaders found intolerable. Without an immediate war, political tensions could have simmered beneath the surface, exploding decades later into a potentially even more devastating conflict, fueled by pent-up frustrations and advances in destructive military technology. Such delayed strife might have meant America emerging into the 20th century profoundly weakened by internal conflict, far less equipped to assume a leading role on the global stage. And speaking of global influence, consider international politics in a world without the American Civil War. America's entry into World War I significantly shifted global power dynamics. Without the accelerated industrialization and unity forged by the Civil War, America's involvement in global conflicts could have been vastly different. Perhaps American neutrality in the Great War would have allowed Germany to claim victory, or at least negotiate favorable terms, dramatically altering Europe's political map and impacting the trajectory of global history. The United States itself, never unified by war, might have remained an isolated, inward-looking nation rather than the international powerhouse we recognize today. Ultimately, this alternate history reveals fascinating insights. It underscores how profoundly significant events ripple outward, shaping societies, economies, and political landscapes in ways we often take for granted. The Civil War, despite its immense tragedy, propelled America toward a future characterized by freedom, innovation, and global leadership. As we imagine a United States untouched by the conflict, we are compelled to ask ourselves, would such an America have been better, worse, or simply different? Could peaceful reform and gradual change have achieved the same ends? Or was violent upheaval truly necessary to forge a unified national identity? Reflect deeply on these questions as we continue to explore this alternate history, understanding that each imagined scenario not only entertains but teaches us about the complex interplay of history, choice, and destiny itself. Let's journey further into our alternate history scenario, into a world shaped by the absence of the American Civil War, and pause at what might have become the single most significant turning point in this hypothetical timeline, the presidential election of 1860 and its aftermath. In our known history, this election triggered Southern secession and the eventual war. But what if Lincoln, rather than igniting immediate conflict, navigated this crisis through diplomacy and compromise? Imagine it vividly. Abraham Lincoln, facing intense pressure from both abolitionists in the North and pro-slavery factions in the South, stands at a critical crossroads. In our world, his staunch resistance against the spread of slavery quickly led to war. However, in this alternate timeline, suppose he chose compromise. not because he supported slavery, but because he desperately sought to preserve the fragile Union, believing perhaps naively that gradual emancipation could prevent bloodshed and bring lasting change. This decision, however noble in intention, would have immediate and lasting consequences. Lincoln might have successfully pacified Southern fears temporarily, crafting agreements and policies that delayed the reckoning with slavery. Picture a dramatic moment, perhaps a great convention held in Washington, where heated debates raged, compromises were struck, and violence narrowly avoided. Newspapers heralded Lincoln's diplomatic triumph. Celebrations filled northern cities, while cautious optimism tempered southern anxieties. Yet, beneath this fragile peace lay unresolved tensions. Slavery remained deeply entrenched in Southern society and economy, a ticking time bomb slowly counting down. Abolitionist activists, feeling betrayed by Lincoln's compromise, would likely have intensified their campaigns, conducting relentless protests and igniting passionate movements demanding immediate freedom. America, though not at war, became increasingly polarized, the national conversation turning into bitter exchanges between North and South. In the decade that followed, America would find itself on a dangerous path of escalating internal tension. The Southern economy, relying on slave labor, struggled with mounting international condemnation and economic isolation as global trade partners began to boycott slave-produced goods. The North, frustrated by slow progress, increasingly viewed the South as morally backward and economically obsolete. The turning point, once thought a masterful political maneuver, would ultimately lead America down a darker road. Decades later, with slavery still persisting, tensions could erupt into an even deadlier conflict, perhaps during the economic crises of the late 19th or early 20th century. Imagine warfare breaking out in a world far more advanced technologically, railroads extensively connecting regions, communication networks allowing rapid mobilization, weaponry far more devastating than anything available in the 1860s. Such a war could have surpassed the original Civil War in scale, devastation, and human suffering. Now picture this vividly. Battles fought with artillery, automatic weapons, even early aircraft, scenes of unprecedented destruction tearing America apart from coast to coast. Without the earlier experience of a unifying conflict, the nation might fracture irrevocably, regional identities becoming fiercely entrenched. America, weakened internally, would likely have forfeited its future as a global superpower, significantly changing the outcomes of world events like World War I and beyond. Personally, as I imagine this alternate timeline, I find myself deeply unsettled. While the instinct to avoid bloodshed is commendable, history often reminds us that delaying necessary confrontations can lead to greater tragedy. Lincoln's original courage to face the horrors of war, painful as they were, forced America to confront and dismantle the moral atrocity of slavery decisively and irreversibly. Without such decisive confrontation, deep-seated issues might fester dangerously, leading to unimaginable consequences in the long run. This critical turning point highlights how delicate the course of history truly is. Decisions made under intense pressure, even with noble intentions, carry enormous potential to reshape the trajectory of entire nations. As we continue exploring this fascinating alternate reality, we must ask ourselves, is peace always preferable if it means postponing inevitable conflict? Or does confronting difficult truths sooner rather than later offer the best hope for genuine transformation? Reflect deeply on these possibilities as we venture further into our speculative journey together, reminding ourselves that history, in all its complexity and unpredictability, continually shapes not just nations, but our very understanding of humanity itself. Now, let's step deeper into our imagined timeline, into the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's pivotal compromise to avoid the Civil War, a decision that, while temporarily preserving peace, carried profound long-term consequences. This critical juncture profoundly reshaped America's trajectory in terms of civil rights, economic growth, and international relations, altering its course in ways both striking and unsettling. First, consider the trajectory of civil rights. Without the powerful impetus provided by war, emancipation would likely have proceeded gradually, sluggishly, and unevenly across America. Freed from the urgency of conflict, Southern states may have fiercely resisted change, clinging tenaciously to the institution of slavery far longer. Enslaved African Americans would have continued to suffer immense oppression, their dreams of liberty postponed by decades, perhaps generations. The abolitionist movement, betrayed and embittered by compromises, might have intensified its efforts, organizing powerful grassroots campaigns in northern states. This struggle will be emotionally charged and prolonged, marked by widespread civil unrest, protests, and relentless activism, a vivid image of a nation deeply divided along moral and ethical lines. Eventually, when slavery did collapse under economic pressures and international condemnation, the aftermath would have been messy and painful. Without the federal oversight and resources brought by Reconstruction in our actual history, newly freed African Americans would have faced daunting challenges alone, forced to build communities, institutions, and identities from scratch in an atmosphere of intense hostility and discrimination. It's deeply troubling to consider the decades of lost progress, the extended denial of basic human dignity, and the long-lasting scars left on American society. Wounds potentially deeper and slower to heal without the definitive moment provided by war. Turning to economic growth, the impact of avoiding the Civil War presents a complicated picture. Initially, economic stability might have persisted longer, particularly in the agrarian South. Cotton and other slave-produced goods would continue driving the Southern economy, temporarily sustaining prosperity, but at the expense of moral legitimacy and long-term economic innovation. Without wartime pressures driving technological advancements such as railroads, telegraphs, manufacturing techniques, and industrial infrastructure, America's overall economic development would likely have slowed considerably. The South, deeply entrenched in its traditional economy, could have become economically isolated, falling behind the rapidly industrializing world. Eventually, as international markets increasingly rejected slave-produced goods due to growing global anti-slavery sentiment, the Southern economy would have entered a period of prolonged economic crisis. The North, industrializing separately, would likely have moved ahead economically, creating stark regional economic disparities that might have fueled further tensions, political strife, and resentment between states. These economic fractures would have delayed America's rise as a global economic power, potentially reshaping the entire 20th century geopolitical landscape. Internationally, the United States would have likely developed very differently. Without the wartime unification experience, America might have remained fragmented politically and culturally, significantly weakening its voice on the world stage. In a world without a decisive American presence, global conflicts, particularly World War I, could have had radically altered outcomes. Picture a European battlefield locked in perpetual stalemate, or worse, a German victory redefining the geopolitical balance of power. America, fragmented and consumed by internal tensions, might have abstained from decisive intervention, fundamentally altering the trajectory of global democracy, economic growth, and political stability. Imagine vividly an early 20th century world with significantly weaker United States, economically fragmented, politically polarized, and lacking moral authority internationally. The rise of authoritarian regimes and aggressive nationalism abroad might have proceeded unchecked, with catastrophic global consequences. America's internal divisions could have effectively removed it from international leadership, altering global history profoundly. Personally reflecting on these outcomes, I feel a profound sense of gratitude and unease. Gratitude, oddly enough, because despite the tragedy and horror of the actual Civil War, it ultimately brought decisive change, forced moral progress, and laid essential groundwork for future equality. Unease, however, at imagining the pain, injustice, and prolonged human suffering that could have accompanied an avoidance of immediate conflict, only to face even graver consequences down the road. This speculative exploration reminds us of an essential truth. History often moves forward through difficult confrontations, not comfortable compromises. The American Civil War, despite its immense cost, served as a crucial, transformative event that defined America's identity, propelled rapid economic and technological advancements, and solidified its role as a leading global power. As we continue our journey through alternate history, keep this deeply complex interplay of consequences in mind. Every historical decision ripples outward, affecting millions of lives and shaping futures we can scarcely imagine. History is not simply a linear progression of events. It's a vibrant tapestry woven from moments of courage, conflict, tragedy, and triumph. As we bring our alternate history journey to a reflective conclusion, consider this profound and challenging question. How would modern America look today had the devastating and transformative events of the Civil War never occurred? The implications, both positive and negative, are compelling, complex, and deeply thought-provoking. On the surface, the absence of the Civil War might appear a blessing. Hundreds of thousands of lives would have been spared, the unimaginable trauma and suffering avoided, and countless families kept intact. Communities, particularly in the South, would not have endured the devastating destruction of war, preserving their cities, towns, and economic foundations. The societal fractures caused by war among brothers, neighbors, and fellow countrymen might never have occurred, potentially allowing for greater regional harmony and less deeply entrenched animosity in certain historical respects. Perhaps without the bitter memory of violence, the United States could have sought gradual, peaceful reforms addressing slavery, transitioning slowly but steadily toward freedom through diplomacy, legislation, and societal evolution. Economically, a slower pace of industrialization might have meant a less exploitative and more balanced growth, with fewer dramatic boom and bust cycles. Internationally, a more cautious and measured American presence could have contributed to a less aggressive foreign policy, fostering diplomatic relations based on mutual understanding rather than dominance. However, as we dive deeper, the negative implications of avoiding the Civil War become profoundly apparent and intensely troubling. Without the moral reckoning forced by violent conflict, the institution of slavery would likely have persisted far longer, leaving millions more subjected to unimaginable suffering, brutality, and exploitation. The path toward racial equality, already prolonged and difficult in our actual history, would have become even more arduous, perhaps extending institutionalized discrimination and oppression well into the 20th century and beyond. Social divisions between North and South, already pronounced, could have grown even wider, deepening cultural mistrust and resentment. America might have evolved not as a unified nation, but as a fragmented federation of regions, each holding distinct identities, ideologies, and economies, regions connected by fragile political alliances rather than genuine unity or shared values. This fragmentation would weaken America's international influence and moral standing globally, altering key global events, perhaps negatively, as democratic ideals and progressive causes worldwide lost a powerful advocate. Economically, while avoiding immediate destruction, a slower industrialization might have cost America dearly in terms of global competitiveness, innovation, and technological advancement. The American economy, particularly in the South, could have stagnated, lagging significantly behind European powers during critical developmental years. The loss of wartime-driven technological breakthroughs, such as the extensive railroad networks, rapid industrial manufacturing methods, and communication systems like the telegraph, would have drastically reshaped America's trajectory, delaying its rise as an economic superpower by decades. Politically, the absence of the war would mean the absence of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, constitutional cornerstones that abolished slavery, provided equal protection under the law, and safeguarded voting rights. The legal and political progress essential to shaping the America we know today might have been delayed or compromised indefinitely, drastically altering modern civil rights movements, suffrage expansions, and social justice initiatives. Moreover, America's cultural identity, born out of conflict, reconciliation, and ultimately progressive evolution, would be vastly different. The iconic American identity as a melting pot of diverse cultures unified by shared ideals and experiences might never have emerged. Instead, the nation might remain permanently divided, its distinct regional identities entrenching further, resisting assimilation, and undermining the idea of a unified national ethos. Reflecting deeply on this hypothetical scenario, I personally grapple with a profound sense of paradox. The war was horrific, yet undeniably transformative, tragic yet historically essential. Without the Civil War, America might have enjoyed temporary peace, yet faced even greater suffering and deeper divisions in the long term. It challenges us to reconsider our own historical perceptions, recognizing that true societal progress often comes not from peaceful compromises, but from confronting injustice directly, even when the price is steep. Ultimately, imagining a world without the Civil War reminds us vividly of history's complexity. Every choice, every event, carries vast implications, affecting countless lives and future generations. By exploring these alternate possibilities, we better understand and appreciate the profound historical forces that have shaped our modern society. The America we live in today, with all its flaws and virtues, reflects centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and courage. Profound reminders that history is not merely a sequence of inevitable events, but a dynamic tapestry woven from human action, tragedy, triumph, and transformation. As we journey together through this fascinating alternate history, imagining a United States untouched by the Civil War, we've seen just how profoundly a single moment in history can shape the destiny of an entire nation. But now, I want to turn the conversation over to you. What do you think about this alternate scenario? Would the absence of civil war have ultimately been beneficial, fostering gradual reform and a more peaceful society? Or would delaying conflict only have deepened America's divisions, setting the stage for even greater tragedy down the road? I'd love to hear your perspectives, theories, and insights in the comments below. History isn't just about facts and dates. It's about understanding human choices and their lasting consequences. Your thoughts and discussions help breathe life into history, bringing these intriguing scenarios to vivid reality. And if you've enjoyed diving into this alternate history with me today, be sure to check out our next video, where we'll explore another captivating scenario. What if Abraham Lincoln had survived his assassination? Imagine how the trajectory of America might have changed had this influential leader continued to guide the nation through Reconstruction. Thank you for joining me in exploring these fascinating possibilities. Don't forget to subscribe to What If Chronicles 2.0 and hit the notification bell to continue our journey through history's endless and captivating alternate realities. See you in the next adventure.